Why should you care about people in prison? Aren't they all criminals? Well, let me explain why this is important in today's lecture on Thank you for watching. My name is Mark Chang, and this is the first of 4 videos on Christianity and prison abolition. Today we assess what the current situation is like for prisons in North America. So we're not going to get into any Bible or faith stuff just yet. Next week we're going to talk about the Bible and what it says about prisoners. And the week after that we'll talk a little more theology, talk about God's judgment and mercy. And in our final week we will reflect on how we respond to all of this as church. But enough of an intro, let's get right into it. What's the situation like for prisons in North America? To talk about this, I want to introduce you to 2 people, Angela Davis and Michelle Alexander. Depending on your age, you might already heard the name of Angela Davis. She was new to me, however, and just reading her Wikipedia page was fascinating. Davis grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, and her life touches on some of the key moments in this Black civil rights movement. She is incredibly smart. She studies philosophy around the world, namely in Frankfurt University, and by age 25, she's acting assistant professor at the University of California, Los Angeles. She was wooed by Princeton and turned them down. Within a year of her hiring, however, the Board of Regents fires her because she is a member of the Communist Party. And they did that at the urging of the California governor at the time, Ronald Reagan. She fights back and she wins her court case, but the university then fires her again, this time claiming that she used inflammatory language. But that isn't why she's famous. In August of 1970, a 17-year-old named Jonathan Jackson storms into a courtroom in Marin County, California. And once in the courtroom, he arms the defendants with guns and they take the judge, the prosecutor, and 3 jurors as hostages. There's a police chase and the judge is killed. What's the connection to Davis? Well, both Jackson and Angela Davis were members of the Black Panthers, and Jackson occasionally worked as a bodyguard for Davis. And the guns that Jackson used were registered under Davis's name. Davis becomes a fugitive, and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover puts her on the 10 most wanted list. When she is caught in New York, Richard Nixon congratulates the FBI on its capture of the dangerous terrorist Angela Davis. But was she a terrorist? Did she actually aid Jackson? This becomes a huge news story and debate. Davis is arrested for a year. Part of it she's held in solitary confinement. And the Rolling Stones write a song about her. John Lennon and Yoko Ono write a song about her.
Angela, they put you in prison. Angela.
She gets support from all over the place. Even the United Presbyterian Church donates to her legal fees. Davis is acquitted of all charges and she's freed. She continues teaching in different universities, although sometimes in secret, with the university hiding what room she's lecturing from. She's left the Communist Party in the 1990s, considers herself a socialist, is still very politically and academically engaged. All of that's just an intro to her 2003 book, Are Prisons Obsolete? It's no surprise, given her experience, that prisons become an area of focus for Davis. Her personal story is right at that intersection of race and gender and the justice system. But some might say, well, it's her personal experience that disqualifies her. She's biased, she's a communist, she's a radical feminist, she's a lesbian. Well, okay then, ignore anything I just told you about her fascinating life and let's just look at her book. It's pretty straightforward and she doesn't say anything that wouldn't be obvious to us today. In it, she starts by documenting the sudden increase in the prison population in the United States. Looking at California specifically, Davis says that prior to the mid-60s, there were 9 prisons in California. In the 1970s, California doesn't build any new prisons throughout that decade. And then in the 80s, the number of prisons doubles. 12 more are built in the 1990s, and now California has 35 adult institutions. As of 2016, there were 2.2 million Americans incarcerated. She names this as the prison industrial complex. Check out this chart. See how the numbers in the prisons explode in the 1980s? We'll get into the reasons for that just a little bit later. Davis highlights three features of this prison industrial complex. The first is that it is fundamentally racist. The population of these prisons are disproportionately black and Latino, and Davis draws a connection between the end of slavery and the development of a criminal justice system that could, quote, legally restrict the possibilities of freedom for the newly released slaves. All the ways that the prison system punished and extracted forced labor from black bodies is a perpetuation of slavery. We're going to expand on that in Michelle Alexander's book, and in case you think racism is just an American issue, we'll talk about Canada in a minute too. The second feature of the penal system is the way that it's gendered. Davis talks about the even harsher conditions faced by women in prison, for whom sexual abuse has become an institutionalized component of punishment behind prison walls. Feminine criminality, she says, is treated more harshly, viewed as more aberrant and more threatening to society than male criminality. When incarcerated, men are just, well, they're criminals, but women are construed as insane. And thirdly, the creation of private prisons has created a profit motive that benefits from higher levels of incarceration. Labor from prisons generates all types of goods and services, from buildings to electronic devices to meals and healthcare. She quotes Alan Hornblum's book Acres of Skin, which highlights the case of Albert Kligman, a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. Kligman conducted hundreds of experiments on prisoners, and once said in a 1966 interview, "All I saw before me were acres of skin." It was like a farmer seeing a fertile field for the first time. His experiments were shut down by 1974, and there's now regulations prohibiting prisoners as research subjects, but this is after numerous cosmetics and skin creams were already tested. Companies like Johnson & Johnson, Ortho Pharmaceutical, and Dow Chemical have all benefited from these experiments. And even if you're not profiting from prison labor directly, there's profits made by companies that sell products back to these prisons. Dial Soap, Nestle Food Service, HP, AT&T, Verizon, just to name a few. And in the 1990s, Vitapro Foods in Montreal was contracted to supply soy-based meat substitutes to inmates in Texas, a contract that was worth $34 million a year. Davis will go on to say that prisons need to be abolished, not just reformed, but I'm going to hold back on that debate for now. What she does show is that whatever you think of prisons, we have to acknowledge that there are people getting rich off of a system that disproportionately affects people of color and causes excessive harm to women in particular. Now on to Michelle Alexander. Alexander is a civil rights advocate and professor of social justice at Union Theological Seminary in New York. She wrote The New Jim Crow in 2010, which is a very important, pivotal work. If you read just one thing in this mini course of ours, her book is what I recommend to you. Her argument is that the current carceral system is a continuation of the Jim Crow laws, and it uses the war on drugs as a tool to maintain the caste system in the United States. Angela Davis drew a connection between slavery and the prison system, and Michelle Alexander fleshes that out, showing clear examples of how the justice system is perpetuating discrimination. We have a primarily Canadian audience here, so before I can talk about the new Jim Crow, I think I need to explain what the old Jim Crow was. I thought it was just a guy named Mr. Crow who had some particularly bad laws. That's not the case. It comes from a minstrel character named Jim Crow and the song Jump Jim Crow, which would be performed in blackface by white actor Thomas D. Rice in the early 1800s. It was such a popular show at the time that Jim Crow became another pejorative name for blacks. After slavery was abolished, laws that legalized racial segregation became known as Jim Crow laws. Black codes appeared in the South as a way of putting black citizens into indentured servitude and stripped them of their voting rights. These laws continued for 100 years, right up to the mid-1960s. For myself, I didn't realize how long these laws lasted and how recently they ended. And just because laws change doesn't mean attitudes do. Michelle Alexander shows that there are historical parallels between the segregation laws and mass incarceration. Conservatives of the 1970s and 1980s, she writes, sought to appeal to the racial biases and economic vulnerabilities of poor and working class whites through racially coded rhetoric on crime and welfare. Whether intended or not, the war on drugs became a way of legalizing discrimination and perpetuating political disfranchisement. How is the war on drugs connected with all of this? Well, let me explain. It was Richard Nixon who called drug abuse to be the public enemy number one in 1971.
Public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
Right off the bat, this was more about politics than about helping people with addictions. Assistant to President Nixon, John Ehrlichman, said in a 1994 interview that the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and the black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew that we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or blacks, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Alexander says that Nixon's so-called war was largely rhetorical, and it wasn't until 1982 when Ronald Reagan officially declared a war on drugs and backed it up with a media offensive that depicted economically struggling inner city communities, which largely consisted of people of color, as especially prone to crime and drugs. They targeted crack cocaine as the biggest offender and stirred up a media frenzy about this drug epidemic, calling crack the issue of the year. And imagery of crack cocaine was typically racially charged, featuring, Alexander says, black crack whores, crack babies, and gangbangers, reinforcing already prevalent racial stereotypes of black women as irresponsible, selfish welfare queens and black men as predators. Harsh penalties and minimum sentencing for cocaine followed suit, but the laws always punished crack cocaine more severely than powdered cocaine, even though they're the same drug. The difference was that crack cocaine was used in black communities and powder cocaine in white communities. The war on drugs, Alexander argues, was always cloaked in this race-neutral language, and that offered whites opposed to racial reform a unique opportunity to express their hostility towards blacks and black progress without being exposed to the charge of racism. Alexander isn't just critical of Republicans here, she has some of the most scathing things to say about Bill Clinton too. He used this war on drugs as a way of proving that he was also tough on crime. In 1992, he flew home to Arkansas to oversee the execution of Ricky Ray Rector, who Alexander says was a mentally impaired black man who had so little conception of what was about to happen to him that he asked for dessert from his last meal to be saved for him until the morning. After the execution, Clinton remarked, "I can be nicked a lot, but no one can say I'm soft on crime." It was the war on drugs that led to an explosion in the rates of incarceration, and it has had a devastating impact on communities of color. A 2002 study from the University of Washington showed that Seattle police consistently targeted their drug busts on one downtown market, where they were more likely to stop and arrest a black drug dealer than a white dealer. This despite the fact that most citizens reported suspected drug use in residences, never outdoors. And the police also targeted crack cocaine, which was used more commonly in the black community, even though Seattle hospitals reported more overdose death from heroin, a drug that was used more widely in the white community. This demonstrated that, whether it was intentional or not, police followed a racialized cultural script about who and what constitutes the drug problem. White people were not perceived as drug offenders, and the police attention focused on black communities. Black youth and white youth might have similar rates of drug use, but it's the black community who are more likely to be stopped by police, more likely to be prosecuted, and more likely to face a harsher punishment. And that criminal record will impact the rest of their lives. Alexander gives this heartbreaking example of those consequences from a drug bust that happened in Hearne, Texas. In the year 2000, Irma Faye Stewart, a single mother of two, was caught up in a drug sweep in which 25 men and 2 women were arrested, all but one of them African American. This prompted by the testimony of one informant who had lied to prosecutors. Stewart states that she's innocent, but the bail is set at $70,000 and she can't afford it. She spends a month in jail with no one to care for her children. The court-appointed attorney tells her that if this goes to court, she could face 5 to 99 years. And desperate, Stewart pleads guilty. She's released on probation. Eventually, the case is thrown out and all of the charges are dismissed, except for Stewart. Because of her plea, Stewart was branded as a drug felon. She's not eligible for food stamps, can't vote for 12 years, and was evicted from public housing. And then without housing, her children could be taken from her, so she has them put up in various homes while she sleeps rough. Another victim of that same drug bust was Clifford Reynolds. He returned home to Bryan, Texas to attend the funeral of his 18-month-old daughter. Before the funeral, police show up and handcuff him. He begs to let them see his daughter before she's buried, and they refuse. They say he needs to testify about this recent drug bust. He denies witnessing any drug transaction. He doesn't know what they're talking about. And that is seen as a refusal to cooperate, and Reynolds is indicted on felony charges. After a month in jail, all of his charges are dropped. He's free, he's proven innocent. But now he's lost his job, lost his apartment, lost his furniture, lost his car, and lost his last chance to say goodbye to his daughter. And this sort of tragedy is perpetuated again and again. Listen to Alexander speak about the role misdemeanors play in impacting someone's life.
If you know anything at all about how this system works, you know that if you're poor, you likely can't pay that misdemeanor fine. And you might lose your job because of the time you spent showing up in court. And these misdemeanor offenders, they too can follow you for the rest of your life in this era of technology. They can show up on background checks. They can be the reason you're denied employment, denied access to housing. And suddenly this little misdemeanor offense is the reason you're unemployed or homeless. And now this little misdemeanor is being used against you in your sentencing hearing because you robbed a convenience store or sold some weed because you were hungry or desperate for cash. And then the judge looks at you and says the words, repeat offender. And the prosecutor says, yeah, he's nothing but a troublemaker. He's had a number of run-ins with the law. So yes, it matters. It really matters when we show up in the lives of poor people with nothing but a hammer. Jesus taught that he who is without sin should cast the first stone. Well, we have become a nation of stone throwers. And in this era of mass incarceration, it is not enough to drop your own stone. We have got to be willing to catch the stones raining down on the most vulnerable, and we must be willing to stand up to the stone throwers and disarm them. I believe.
At this point, us Canadians are shaking our heads with horrified bewilderment the way we normally do to our neighbours at the South. But before you get too self-righteous, the war on drugs was an issue here too. Our politicians also like to claim that they are tough on crimes. Our prisons also house a disproportionate number of people of color. We might not have had the Jim Crow laws, but we share the same history with colonialism. In our case, however, the victims of that colonial brutality was First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. The report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission states that Canada's treatment of Indigenous peoples was an act of physical, biological, and cultural genocide. They say that our legal system failed to provide justice for residential school survivors, many of whom were left with trauma, then self-medicating with drugs and alcohol, and then criminalized for that addiction rather than hospitalized, partly because of the war on drugs. Once an Indigenous person was arrested, they're more likely to be sentenced to prison, resulting in an overrepresentation of Aboriginal people in custody. Even though Indigenous people make up 4% of the Canadian population, in prisons they account for 28%. In women's prisons, the percentage increases to 43% Indigenous women, almost half. The TRC draws a direct line between those residential schools and the situation we face in our Canadian prisons. Researcher Akwatu Kinti documents that Black Canadians are also overrepresented in our prison systems because of the war on drugs. He states that the racial profiling has become a pervasive reality for Black Canadians due to the war on drugs' particular focus on Black communities. Large segments of the white population engage in similar levels of drug use, and yet the war on drugs disproportionately targets Black communities. The result is that instead of early treatment for addictions, Black youth are criminalized. Mental health issues are unaddressed, stigmatization is compounded, and that vicious cycle of criminalization deepens. This is not just a problem for the United States, it's an issue for us too. I've given you a lot of information, but I've still not told you enough. All would agree that the war on drugs is a problem, but Angela Davis and Michelle Alexander would take it a step further and say that we need to end all prisons. There's still not enough information here for you to make a decision about that, but I hope I've shown you that the prison system is pretty messed up, that there are issues here, that women, the poor, those who are racialized by society are disproportionately affected, that something needs to be done. I leave you with Michelle Alexander's challenge to her students at Union Theological Seminary. Thanks for watching.
We can agree that what is needed now at this critical juncture is not mere tinkering or tokenism, but as King insisted more than 40 years ago, a radical restructuring of our society. Then perhaps we can also agree that a radical restructuring of our approach to advocacy is in order as well. And I dare say, though I'm not a theologian, perhaps a radical new approach to our theology is in order as well. For those of us who consider ourselves people of faith and people of conscience, we must acknowledge that we have been far too quiet for far too long as our nation built a penal system predicated on denying to God's children the very forms of forgiveness, compassion, and opportunities for redemption that we claim to cherish. What sort of theology tolerates this complicit silence? Perhaps the revolution must first begin within us.